that day that a joint session of Congress was convened to count the electoral ballots in the 2020 presidential election, reflecting results that had already been certified by each of the 50 sovereign states and the District of Columbia. Several Republican lawmakers objected to the count based on false claims of voter fraud in previous elections. Some Democrats had objected to various electoral slates. It was during this process and this one, however, that, as you see, that the Capitol was breached, prompting Capitol Police to stop the proceedings. They evacuated the House chamber and the Senate chamber. And at that moment, Congressman Dean Phillips could be heard shouting from the balcony at the Republican objectors, "This is because of you." And he joins us now. Congressman Dean Phillips of Minnesota joins me live now for more. Take us back to that moment, Congressman Phillips, and what stands out in your mind.
Terry, I think I speak for millions right now, as I did for millions back on January 6th of 2021, when I screamed, "This is because of you," at Paul Gosar. It was a feeling of disbelief, images and a moment that I only imagined could happen in other countries, never our own. And as we reflect on that day, of course, it was traumatic for those of us in the room, not just members of Congress, but staff and journalists and Capitol employees. But the collective trauma of the country is what I want to remember today. What we went through was horrible. And the way we get out of it is together, Terry. And I've been thinking a lot about the fact that we should not fear those that broke into the Capitol that day, the insurrectionists. The law will take care of them. Many are being prosecuted right now. What we need to fear are those in Congress, the man who lives at Mar-a-Lago, who incited the insurrection, inspired it, enabled it, and continue to propagate a miserable, destructive, and very consequential lie that is misinforming far too many Americans and inspiring them, I'm afraid, to continue this pursuit to undermine our democracy. We've got to solve this together. I'm optimistic that we can, but that's surely what's on my mind today.
And those are serious matters. Let me pick them up one at a time. First, the idea that we have to go through this together if we're going to get past it. I want to ask you about that day and the succeeding day or two with your Republican colleagues. It did seem to us on the outside, well, that it was a come to Jesus moment for a lot of them. A lot of them stepped forward to the microphones, Lindsey Graham and others, obviously Leader Kevin McCarthy, and condemned Donald Trump for exactly those lies. You don't see that much anymore, but did you have a sense in the aftermath of the attack that you were closer to your Republican colleagues, and what happened?
Oh, Terry, absolutely. In fact, after we escaped the House chamber and were escorted to a safe room, tens and tens of we Democrats and Republicans spent hours together in a room. And I have to tell you, the moments spent there were unifying, gratifying, but sadly very fleeting. But there were moments then when, Terry, I thought that we actually might come together as a Congress, not just to fulfill our mission to get back into the chamber and certify the election, which we did, but most importantly, to hold those to account who had inspired an insurrection. I can't tell you how many of my Republican colleagues I spoke with that day and night who felt exactly the same way. It was Liz Cheney, with whom I spent part of that time watching the broadcasts of what was happening outside. From the moment it happened to today, she is as resolute about getting to the truth and holding those accountable as anybody. But the dissipation and erosion of that intention and purpose by too many of my other colleagues is disappointing. But I have to say, Terry, it's still a responsibility of every one of us in Congress to be respectful, to find common ground, to get to know each other, find some humanity in each other. For if we don't model that behavior for the country, I think it's going to be awfully difficult to expect our fellow citizens to do that in our stead.
Exactly. We all have to do it. I want to pick up on that. You remember the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus, which advocates for a bipartisan January 6th commission, did at the time. Ultimately, that commission voted down. The House Select Committee was tasked with investigating the attack. So as part of a problem solvers committee, you know, there is a sense that there's no common ground anymore between people across this cultural as well as political divide. Is that true, or are we exaggerating it? I keep talking about these polls that I've seen that find that when asked to describe your typical Democrat, the average Republican describes an extremist, and Democrats do the same. Is there still common ground? Do you get a sense of that, or are we just going to duke it out indefinitely?
Terry, let me say that it's not as bad as it's portrayed and not nearly as good as it must be. And I say to many that we have a problem with an angertainment industry in the United States. There are media enterprises that thrive by distracting and dividing, pointing out only the scary and the frightening. The fact is, Congress is a human enterprise, just like any other enterprise or organization. And there are possibilities. The Problem Solvers Caucus, Terry, is a perfect example. 28 Democrats, 28 Republicans, very diverse political perspectives and geographies and backgrounds. But we make it our intention to get to know each other and build respect, set aside the political swords, if you will. And we do find common ground. You know, we are the workhorses of Congress, not the show horses. You don't know many of our names, of course. But we've gotten a lot done. And I think the antidote to this great challenge that we face is doing more of that, and not just at our Problem Solvers Caucus table or just in Congress, but all around the country, for everybody to take a single step towards someone who sees things very differently and show some mutual respect for your countrymen and countrywomen. If we don't, I'm afraid that the future will be dark, but I'm still optimistic that with the right people populating Congress, if people get out and vote next November, no matter who you vote for on what side of the aisle, I do ask that people consider the integrity, the courage, and the character of those for whom they vote. If they give that consideration, I'm optimistic.
Well, maybe we in the media can take a step forward there and join you and maybe pay a little less attention to the tweeters and the show horses, and maybe focus a little bit on the workhorses. But let me get back to January 6th. You mentioned Liz Cheney and the accountability that she was talking about from the beginning. That used to be a conservative value, but now we are, you know, in the midst of prosecutions, continued investigation, the Select Committee. What does justice for January 6th look like to you?
Well, justice for January 6th is being addressed right now. I think 800 charged so far during the Capitol insurrection, the riots. That's important. There has to be punishment. The law has to be followed. But real accountability starts with those who I mentioned earlier in our interview, those who incited, those who enabled, and those who continue to propagate a lie that is one of the most destructive missiles, if you will, to democracy I've ever experienced in my life. You know, we are a country with many freedoms and liberties, including political speech, which I honor and value. But I do believe there's a line when elected officials knowingly, willingly undermine our democracy, knowingly and willingly misinform their constituents and Americans. And accountability, ultimately, I believe, may not be handled by courts of law, but hopefully by voters. And that's why I was heartened to see Liz Cheney and her father, Dick Cheney, the only two Republicans that were here today in the chamber to commemorate this day. I believe there are honorable Republicans in our country who recognize the consequences of their silence, of their enabling, if you will. And I'm optimistic that their better angels will rise, and that's my expectation. It may not be courts of law that decide this. It will be up to Americans, and that is the hallmark of democracy, the participation of the voter to handle justice when it comes to politics.
Well, I love that optimism. I'm going to attribute it to your Midwestern roots there. Minnesota, nice. I'm from Chicago, so I can't go too far that way, but go Bears, and Congressman Dean Phillips from Minnesota. Thanks very much for being with us and offering.
Thank you, Terry. Go Vikings, of course.